Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Coco Bongo Experimental Processed Colombia from Doc Coffee Roasters. And there's the box right there. And Doc, based out of Amsterdam, Netherlands. And this coffee is our January 2025 Coffee of the Month, as it was voted on by you guys as the coffee you most wanted to see us review. We went with the term experimental processed Colombian coffee because I couldn't find the technical term for what they described the processing of this coffee to be. I do believe it is technically a coconut co-ferment, but for the purposes of this review, we'll just simply call it an experimental processed Colombian coffee. But yes, Doc is a coffee roaster that has appeared on this channel on numerous occasions, and one that has grown on me over the years as I've mostly been focusing on their wash processed coffees, and I've been enjoying them a lot more as we focused on those wash processed coffees. That being said, the theme of January's Coffee of the Month was to find some really wild, funky, out there coffees, and this one right here does seem to have a bit of a reputation, so I'm sure you guys are looking forward to us discussing this one, as this right here is day 42. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our higher extraction one at a 17:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. We also went a little bit more fine on that grind as well. Roast profile for this coffee, even with all the experimentation done on this one, you can tell that it is a bit lighter than the majority of European coffees out there, as this one is technically their filter roast, and I do believe once upon a time this coffee used to be omni roasted. That being said, it's obviously not necessarily the lightest coffee in the entire world, but even then, it does continue to remain actually surprisingly one of the lighter roasted coffee roasters based out of the Netherlands, as they do seem, well, this coffee at least specifically did seem lighter than some of the stuff we've had recently from either Manhattan or Fried Hats. So I will say that this one is on the more moderately light side of things. Hopefully that gives you a good idea. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression through the V60, and it definitely had an expectedly interesting start to this one with the aroma of the whole beans not necessarily smelling too bad. When I first opened this bag of coffee, I said, okay, this isn't necessarily that bad. However, the aroma of the bloom itself was definitely on the other side of that spectrum, as it offered a slightly rancid aroma to it, which did seem to translate into the cup itself ever so slightly, as it's present in the aroma after you've brewed it too. Expectedly tropical in a blatant sense with plenty of the pina colada-like attributes. So this was just me getting familiarized and acquainted with this coffee, and I said, okay, given how much I'd heard about this coffee, it isn't quite as bad as I was expecting. That being said, it certainly wasn't something I was looking forward to continuing to work on. Day 18 through the Chemex, and there's more of the same, as there's that slightly rancid aroma in the brew itself. It's not necessarily translating as much into the cup. It's there, but much more in the aroma of the coffee itself. When you're drinking it, you don't get that same sort of rancid feel, at least early on within the first couple of days. There's some more undesirable qualities though this time around, as it's a little less clean with some subtle but prominent funkiness and a very strong coconut-like attribute yet again. I don't need to highlight the coconut attributes to this one early on, mostly because it's going to be something that's very apparent throughout the time we're discussing it. Day 21 through the April brewer, and the coffee is incrementally becoming a bit more wild each time we brew it, as the slightly rancid aroma is translating a bit more into the coffee itself. Funkiness is increasing as it does continue to radiate a very strong tropicality, but a little bit less cleanliness overall. So this wasn't trending in the ideal direction, especially for this brew method, but we move on to day 24 as we opted for the V60 with Doc's recipe, and the coffee is interestingly a bit better, as it's not quite as harsh in the cup itself, leading to the potential sentiment that it is best through this brew method. And that's kind of the idea that I had going into it, was hopefully the V60 wouldn't necessarily accentuate too many of the more undesirable qualities to it. I fully expected the Chemex to, so this was kind of validating that idea. Pretty blatant with strong coconut-like intensity yet again, and a very strong artificial pineapple juice, extremely direct as you would fully expect. Day 27 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the coffee is also a bit better this time around, as it's not as harsh in the cup itself, translating into plenty of the blatant coconut-like qualities, definitely reminiscent of what I would describe as coconut suntan lotion, and it definitely has that not just in the aroma, but it is presented within the coffee itself. And it does have a, we'll say, relatively decent balance for this one in general, because yes, it is obnoxiously coconut forward, but as far as the rest of it goes, I said, okay, you could have some more undesirable qualities, maybe some really harsh bitterness, maybe some really harsh funkiness, maybe some really harsh fermentiness, but for the most part, it did seem to keep a little bit toned down in those aspects. Day 30 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and the coffee might actually be a bit better being pushed, and that's kind of my takeaway from this day, as it wasn't necessarily ideal off brew. It did cool down, leaving a bitter and at times rancid feel that was on par with the strong aroma of the beans. Bitterness in line with the listed vanilla, as they do have a vanilla milkshake on this coffee, but I wouldn't necessarily say that that's something that I felt was anywhere near as apparent as the other qualities of this coffee. It does seem to offer a lot of the processing feel within the finish, so the more it cooled down, the more it lasted on the palate, the less I enjoyed this one. Day 33 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and the aroma of the coffee has become even more rancid over time. And it's at this moment, every time I was brewing this coffee, I said, not only is the aroma just very off-putting in the brew itself, but you do smell that aroma within wherever you've brewed the coffee for an extended period of time. It is relatively toned down compared to some of the previous days, but once again, unsurprisingly, very tropical coconut forward. Day 36 final notes we have through the V60 with those higher extraction adjustments, and the coffee is continuing to remain expectedly direct, as you do get plenty of that slightly rancid feel, and more of the more you drink of the coffee, the more it becomes present, as it's still very pronounced in the aroma itself. Otherwise, well-defined pineapple pina colada-like feel with a very direct coconut quality. All right, so let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we only have 3 level 5s, but let's go through those 3 level 5s. We'll start with the finish, level 5. Is anybody even a little bit surprised that this coffee has that obnoxiously long-lasting finish to it? And I fully expected that going into it, and I was maybe hopeful at times, given that the coffee didn't feel too overbearing, and I wouldn't even necessarily say that it's all that overbearing. I've had coffees that may have a much more intense, long-lasting finish to them, but given that the finish, especially as you let the coffee cool down, does become a little bit more off-putting, it's not necessarily ideal, so a very long-lasting finish in this one, not surprising whatsoever. Citrus fruit, level 5. Yeah, the pineapple note they have listed on here, it's about as blatant and in your face as pretty much any other note within this coffee, with one exception, of course. And you do feel it throughout the entirety of this one. It just kind of goes together with the other trait we're discussing, which is the stone fruit level 5. Technically, coconut is a stone fruit, so that's where we put it, and it is as blatant as possible. I know that I was fully expecting a lot of coconut, and we were asked before we started working on this coffee, do you even like coconut? And the very strange thing about that is I don't particularly like coconut, but I do like when we get coconut notes within coffees, as they usually come out pretty clean and enjoyable, but obviously that wasn't the case with this coffee. So when you're coupling it with a very strong and we'll just say intense pineapple-like attribute, giving this one that entire pina colada-like feel, but at times a bit more reminiscent of some slightly rancid and maybe we'll say bad fruit, or also some suntan lotion, then obviously that's not necessarily going to be ideal. Handful of level 4s, we'll start with the sweetness level 4. You know, I do have to say that might have been the biggest surprise and takeaway from this coffee, is that it didn't reach that level 5 mark, as I wouldn't necessarily say it was overly sweet in the fruit sense. It was just much more defined and in your face with that fruit senses. Obviously, suntan lotion isn't necessarily sweet, or we'll say bad fruit aren't necessarily sweet. And that's just kind of the takeaway I had from this one, is it's sweet, but not maybe to that level 5 that I was expecting. Acidity, level 4. It was a very bright coffee, and I feel like when it comes to processed coffees like this, I oftentimes find it's a little bit difficult to keep the brightness balanced to the point where it's supposed to be. And that seemed to be the case with this one. Granted, we were pushing this coffee, but that's mostly because it did seem to mitigate some more of the undesirable qualities. If we could really accentuate the overbearing coconut and pineapple feel, then perhaps we wouldn't get as much of that rancid and bitter taste. So that's the main reason, and I think the acidity kind of played a role in that, scoring there at that level 4 mark. Florality, level 3, just a couple of level 3s. and that's a lot of the listed vanilla milkshake that they have on here. It was presented once again in a little bit more of a bitter sense for me. I think that's where the bitterness came. It could either be that the pineapple was unripened, but I do think that it was just much more reminiscent of pineapple juice. But the vanilla, if I was feeling any vanilla, it was much more presented in a bitter sense. So level 3, which is kind of interesting that the bitterness is there at a level 1. So I kind of disagree with that. I'd probably bump that up to a level 2. And then the body level 2, that's also a very interesting one. I think in theory, on paper, with this coffee being brewed through the V60 and it being a Colombian coffee, that one should have scored a lot higher. And then the last thing worth discussing, and most important thing worth discussing, cleanliness level 3. It is so fun to discuss cleanliness or clarity with coffees like this because it is as defined as possible. It is as pronounced as possible. You're tasting coconut, and it doesn't take somebody that has reviewed about 1,000 coffees to tell that this one tastes like coconut or pineapple. They're both so in your face that I feel like this is one of those coffees you could take to somebody that doesn't drink coffee and they'd be like, wow, this is about as blatant of a coconut tasting coffee as possible. So that's one of the reasons why it has to score at least a little bit more on a moderate level, and it's just extremely well defined in that sense. But obviously there's enough to take away from that, given that there is a rancid quality to this coffee, and it's just something that's very pronounced. And if it wasn't maybe present in the aroma, then it wouldn't have impacted the coffee as much. Every time I would go in for a sip and I would take in that aroma, I was like, okay, it's going to be difficult getting through this sip, and that does have to play a role in this tasting wheel. So we're kind of in that weird middle ground where it tastes very defined, but at the same time, it definitely has some undesirable qualities that takes away from that overall cleanliness. Outside of that, it's not necessarily fermenty, it's just a little funky in that sense. So that's where we opted to put it. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This isn't my least favorite coffee that we've ever reviewed, but I do have to put in context that I went into this one with the lowest expectations possible. If anything, I wanted this coffee to turn out a little bit worse than it did. I've heard from people that the initial release of the first Coco Bongo was significantly worse than this coffee was, and I'm not sure it's a road I want to travel down and try that one, given just how much I didn't enjoy this coffee. But I do have to say it makes for an interesting review. A lot of you guys wanted to hear our opinions on this one, and I don't think anybody will be surprised that I just didn't particularly enjoy any part of this coffee. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I think if you really like the taste of coconut, that's a prerequisite to even starting the discussion of liking this coffee. It is just so blatant and obvious in your face. People like Milky Cake. Milky Cake's a little different. It's very sweet. It's got a much, I'll say, better and less fermenty, funky profile to it. So this one's along the same lines, and I hear people discuss these two coffees side by side in a number of ways, mostly because they're just so out there in the way that they are. So if you like that very strong tropical feel, pina colada, suntan lotion, then this one's probably a pretty good fit. But that's honestly probably the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd definitely love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Coco Bongo extended or experimental processed Colombia from Doc Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.